Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Committee of a Whole meeting Monday, March 22nd, 6 p.m. I'd like to remind everyone, the meeting participants, be advised that the meeting will be recorded for public access and broadcast. With that, I would like to call the meeting to order. Motion for the adoption of the agenda? Do I have a motion for the adoption of the agenda? So moved by Councilor
Seconded.
Thorne, so moved by Councilor Lena, seconded by Councilor Thorne. All in favor?
Aye.
Contrary minded? Motion carried. If there are any conflicts of interest, could I please ask the councilors to fill out the form in the middle of the table? Be noted, no conflict of interest declared. With that, we'll move on to new business. And we will call on Laura Legier from Englobe Water to present on the water spend. So from Englobe. Welcome, Laura. Thank you for coming in today.
So we're gonna try to share this.
What's that? You can try.
Just click on it, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna hit share. Okay, we can worry about that. There you go.
Right, thank you, everyone. So you can just go to the first slide, I guess. So just a brief snapshot of what I plan on talking about today. So a brief introduction. I won't take too much of your time, just keep it to the key points, I guess, of our study. Over the scope of work, what the objectives were, findings, and then I'll get to their conclusions and if you have any questions or discussion. Go from there. So again, thank you for having me tonight. My name's Laura Legier. Almost 10 years now. You may know us better as Crandall Engineering. Well, we began as Crandall Engineering long ago, in the 50s, and around 2018 or so, we became added to our services that we can provide. So scope of work. So it's a high-level study. Basically, there was an existing feasibility study for the
Could I get you to just to try to speak a little louder? I apologize. It's hard
Yes.
to capture everything.
This won't pick up your voice.
I apologize in advance. I have a terrible voice for speaking. So,
Oh, you have a great voice.
Sounds lovely. We can hear you fine.
I have old ears as well.
So there was an existing water feasibility study done in, I think, 2009 or so. And so our scope of work was to really update that study that was done before, kind of considering, new changes in the village, now town, expanded boundaries, et cetera. So it's a high-level study, so we're looking at a high-level concept of what a water system could look like for, I guess, the former village of Salisbury, or the core village community, let's say. Updated serviceable areas, demand how much water we need to provide this for the community. Potential water source locations. I guess two main options there, one being connection to the city of Moncton, or the other option being a community-owned source. And finally, high-level costing. So like I mentioned, we looked at two different options for a water system for the community. One being the city of Moncton. It was already brought up as an option back in 2009. So we kind of rekindled those thoughts, got in touch with the city to see if there was any possibility that they would be interested. And the other option being a community-owned water source, a groundwater source of your own that you would own and maintain. And the concept assumes that the main future development areas would be up the Virgin Road based off area. So that's a kind of a good thing to keep in mind when we look at the next slide. So this is kind of, it may be a little bit hard to understand, but this is what a water system could look like for the village. I say village because it's mainly the village that would be serviceable without adding, you know, more booster stations, extra tanks, et cetera. So we see the red dot up on the kind of left-hand side is kind of the high point in the village, so assumed location for water storage. From there, it allows you to feed by gravity into your distribution network. I guess one of the main points, and I think I'll mention it again later on, but I'll mention it now, is no matter where your water source is, the remainder of your system would really look quite similar. So you still need a water storage tank, you still need a distribution, you know, network. A lot of those main components stay the same. Main difference is the distance to your actual water supply. So like I mentioned, we did initiate discussions with the city. They were open in general to the idea of supplying water. You know, their key point was mainly the distance, the amount of infrastructure required to actually bring water from where it ends, on Salisbury Road to the community.
So does that require more pumping stations or?
Not necessarily, you know, at this point, we didn't get into the nitty gritty of the design. I
Yep.
think it's likely that it could be pumped, directly to a point in the village if it's a strict transmission line without water connections on it. It's mainly the distance. Yeah. So we're looking at like 16 kilometers for getting the water to your high point where you have your water storage tank.
No, would it come to the village fairly straightforward? It's just from the village up to the highway would be where you need more of the pumping? Or do you
So
haven't looked into that?
we haven't gotten into that. I think, I don't think you would necessarily need like multiple pumping, stations. So you would probably have like one main connection point. If you need to boost the water at that point, you would do it there and
Yeah.
go right to your system. I think what we've assumed, now don't quote me on this, I'm just kind of going by memory at this point, is that you likely can have enough pressure to get to your storage tank, but you need to boost it up into your tank.
Yeah.
So,
I just know that we're planning on doing a fire hall right in the village.
Yeah.
And that would be a wonderful location for a pumping station if it was also being done in tandem with that future
Right.
development.
yeah, so still some fine tuning on the design
Yep.
side, yeah. So on the community-owned water supply, there were 4 target zones identified. One was kind of immediately put aside, being close to the current sewage lagoon. So that means 3 zones remained. The highest priority zone was at kind of the intersection of the Pollard and Petitpodiac rivers. So that's zone D, as we called it. Zone A being the next priority area would be the Little River and Petitpodiac River. And zone B is kind of in between the two along the Petitpodiac River. So these areas were developed based on geology of the area, bedrock mapping, past studies, well logs from the provincial database, that type of information, all reviewed by our hydrogeologist as the most promising areas that could sustain the source. So,
Could you explain a little bit more how that would look if one of those sources was developed?
sure, like in terms of what the water system would look like?
Yeah, is it just a well in the ground? Is there more infrastructure to it than just that, or?
So typically, if you have your own water source, you'd have a well, so there's a process to follow. So there's the whole testing process, but at the end of the day, if the water source is good, you'd end up with a well in the ground. Likely 1 or 2 observation wells. You need 2 for the process with the province, and likely those 2 would remain as long-term observation wells. You'd need a water pump house to kind of house your pump controls and your
Infrastructure.
water system. Water treatment is kind of, you know, sometimes needed, sometimes you don't. A lot of communities in the region are strict just chlorination and out to the system. If there is a need for water treatment in this area, it's often like iron manganese type treatment.
Yep.
It would be determined through the testing process if there's a need for treatment.
In those areas, we'll say some of the catchment area of that, would that be limited in terms of what could be done in that area then going forward? In
So
terms of farming and agricultural practices that are currently going on?
Yeah, so there are some limitations. So what happens is that I guess step one is to kind of identify your source, go through the well testing process. It's under the EIA regulations, so you have to register your project with the province under the EIA. If everything goes well, you end up with a good water source. You do your construction project, you design your system, your pump house, whatever is required in terms of infrastructure. Usually you have a small grace period after you commission your well, and then you have to initiate what's called a well field protection study. So that's where it delineates those zones where there would be some restrictions on land use, yeah.
Okay.
How big of a catchment area is that typically?
It's really on a case by case. So the way,
Tributaries, I imagine.
well, yeah, and it's done through groundwater modeling, so it really depends. Like you can't necessarily predict it
Okay.
based on water courses and whatnot in the area and ground contours. They're really modeling what's happening under the surface of the ground. So in New Brunswick, we have kind of 3 zones of protection, zone A, B, C. So zone A is your most protective zone. So it's not typically very large, like it's not out of, the realm of possibility that the municipality would own that zone. So,
Or like a kilometer from the well kind of thing, or not even?
not sure I could put a number on
Oh,
it, but like, it wouldn't be uncommon that it's like the size of a property, I mean,
Yeah.
properties could vary, but.
I noticed that each one of the zones you've identified, there's a farm in each one of those zones.
Yes, yeah, and it was brought to our attention, when we review it, it's not necessarily a deal breaker at this point. But
Yeah.
of course, you would want to be careful in your testing phase, to make
Due
sure you
diligence.
test the quality for,
Yep.
potential contaminants, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and being upstream or downstream may make a difference too, right?
Absolutely.
If the farm is downstream, then less chance that they would be impacted by the restrictions or
Yep.
seriously impacted maybe. So if there's nothing else, I'll just go to the next slide.
Probably gonna be a few more questions.
Yeah, no problem. Well, I'll do my best to address them as they come up. So this is just showing where the zones are. So again, D, B, A, C, as we go from left to right. Most of you are familiar with the area, so we don't need to necessarily linger on that. So in terms of the 2 options, so like I mentioned, very similar concept for both options. Both options have a water transmission, so that's your direct link from your water source to your system, basically, where you wouldn't have actual service connections on it. Of course, the length depends on the location of the source. Either way, you're likely to need a booster station just to overcome the difference in elevations and get your water into your water storage reservoir, a water storage reservoir to manage your peaks and your daily flows, and provide some emergency storage. And then, of course, your distribution piping. On the City of Moncton supply, you're looking at about 16 kilometers of water transmission main. On the independent source, you're looking at, I think it says 8 there. I'm not, got my glasses on, but I can't quite see it. That's assuming, at somewhere in the midpoint of your zone D. So it's probably your longest distance, plus or minus a little bit. So on the City of Moncton side, your pros, I guess, are that you don't have to go through the actual source development. So the water's there. There's not an initial risk in that sense. You don't have to maintain the water source. And then I guess you could service some residents potentially along the Salisbury Road on the east side of the community. And on the owning your own source, it gives you that level of control. For an initial risk that, you know, there has to be a successful source secured. And there are some residents that could be picked up on those.
At the risk of asking a really dumb question on the public record, that would involve tearing up roads to lay the transmission lines, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they, you know, during the design phase, you could look at, you know, what's the best route. You know, maybe it's along the shoulder of the road or in the right way, you know, off road. But at this point, we've assumed that they would follow the roads. It is probably the easiest route.
Mhm.
Not a dumb question at all, though.
Good time to fix the road too.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
that's kind of-
If you need to
Main
do
Street
some
be prepared.
you can go to the next slide. So, I assume that some of you have seen these, some of you who have, on council at least. So on the city of Moncton side, total project cost, we're looking at about 76 million. It's a big number to swallow, but it's also a lot of infrastructure. Assuming, you know, full build out of the water system, right? So
But that's not a 1-year cost.
keep
That's
in
over.
mind exactly
Okay.
that you would never build the entire system at one shot. You would always phase it out into chunks that are more manageable depending on how the
Funding and
funding comes in and how you want to divide up your system. Obviously, there are some components that are
required.
required regardless. And, you know, as we get down to like individual distribution piping, then you can have more play in how you divide that up. So an annual cost of like 0.85 million, I believe. And assuming you would have 100 users or service connections, it works out to about $1,800 per user per year. On the independent source, our figure is 63 million, which works out to about 1,200, just under 1,300 per year per user. And those annual costs are assuming that you would get a funding model similar to what's out there right now with the recent funding programs, assuming a 26% municipality share. So of course, those numbers would be different if the, you know, if there's a different agreement.
That'd be a $15 to $20 million share per year.
Yeah, it's a large figure, like I said, the key is that you would not phase it in a single phase. You would have to phase it out, so, you know, you would start with your source development if that was the selected option, and, you know, that'd be a great phase one, right? Just to secure the source. At that point, you can, you know, do your additional studies to look at how you may want to phase it. As you go.
How many sewer users do we have today?
About 12.
About 1,200? Okay.
So the difference between the two, I was actually surprised that the connecting into an existing source was so much higher. Is it the 8-kilometer difference?
A lot of it is in the piping difference, yeah. It's a long way, and like I mentioned, a lot of the infrastructure.
Right.
So, yeah, we have allowed for like a bulk water purchase amount in the cost, but the bulk of the costing is really in the length of the transmission main, all your property restoration, asphalt, all those things. That's all I have to say on the costing.
30 years is the maximum we can amortize.
Depends on what it is.
Yeah, I don't know with the water system.
I don't know.
Okay.
So
Sorry, what was that?
if we were to
Just the 30
develop
years
this
of
the way it
maximum.
is, you're assuming 1,000 users on that network. Is it expandable to service more users if we have a big subdivision shoot up somewhere? Could we?
Yeah, so it would have to be within like kind of the developed core of the community, so it wouldn't necessarily be worth your while if your new development was not in that main area of town. But, you know, if you had a new development, say up Garden Road, then for sure that would be expandable to service those.
And we would expect that the village is gonna grow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if-
Mhm.
I'm just thinking
by
of
the time-
capacity wise,
I think that's
what's the maximum that it can handle?
Right, so I mean, it will depend on the capacity of the source
Right.
that could be found.
And storage, I imagine.
Storage could be sized, you know, you would always assume a certain growth amount.
Yeah.
I think at this point, at least some 2%, just a conservative figure, just for preliminary sizing, but, all those details would be looked at would do a pre-design study, so.
And those amounts,
Right,
don't, those amounts don't take any grants into account?
Just assuming like a straight, like 27% contribution by the town and a 60,
40 split from the roads.
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Split by the province and federal, so no other grants other than that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
We just looked up the number of years, I think it was you that asked, and it's not exceeding 30 for the water, so
Yeah.
a little bit more flexibility.
Okay. I had a question about, and you didn't touch on it on your slide about costs, but in the report,
Yes,
putting like infrastructure, startup, whatever aside, the operations and maintenance costs per year
Yeah.
was 106,000 for both options. And I couldn't wrap my head around why they would be the same for both, because I would assume we wouldn't have to hire someone to run it, but like, it was only 106,000, so that felt low, and also, I didn't get it.
okay. So I don't have the details in front of me of
Mhm.
what adds up to that number, but in terms of having this number be the same, but again, it's really similar in the tasks your operator would need to do. No, you wouldn't have a well to maintain, but you're still gonna have the distribution system. You're still gonna have to check your chlorine residuals, you know, at multiple places in your system. So it's kind of a normal task. The operator goes around and checks the chlorine level, kind of at different ends of the system, let's say. You still have to maintain your water reservoir, your booster station. So a lot of the tasks are the same.
Okay, so I'm still hiring an operator, even though the city of Moncton would be,
They would
if I'm
be-
tapping into
Right.
theirs,
So they're in charge of providing a usable water source, right?
right?
But you have 16 kilometers of transmission main, so you're probably gonna need to top up your chlorine before it goes
Right,
out.
okay.
You know what I mean? So
Okay,
there's still operation.
right.
And you still need the operator certification.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if we were to decide to go forward with this, and the first, you talked about phasing it.
Yes.
To do that first initial step to determine the water source,
Yeah.
to acquire it, to make sure it's there for us.
Yeah.
What kind of time frame does that take?
So the first step in this case is a geophysical survey, so, I believe that could happen likely before EIA registration, so I say I believe because you would still need to be in touch with the province to confirm that, but, typically that's non-intrusive, so you can proceed with that because it allows you to make your EIA registration more specific. So, you know, I would allow a couple months for that process. Typically, the EIA process, I like to say it's probably about a year to, you know, you submit your EIA, do your correspondence, you do your testing. There's kind of preferred times of years for doing the testing. You don't want to be testing your new well when there's a lot of groundwater infiltration so that you're not overestimating the quantity of water there, so.
No melt.
Yeah, well, and that's right, exactly. So like this time of year, you wouldn't necessarily want to be doing the testing, or you'd want to be doing it very carefully, so.
And August may not be a great time either.
You know, August is not too bad. It's typically pretty dry. Just gotta keep an eye on the conditions, right?
With your volumes of water will be down as well.
It's actually good though, right?
Good.
You wanna estimate them during low
Low time,
conditions,
yeah,
because then you know what can be sustained always, right? You're
Your
on the safe
your base level or base load.
Yeah, yeah, so sometimes it happens that you may want, you know, you may get to a certain point in your testing phase and you want to wait until it's a good time to test it. So I like to say ballpark a year, you know, just to conduct the whole testing phase.
And then, thank you. If we were to, at that point, decide to move forward with it and consistently progress it over a number of years, how long should we anticipate something like that taking?
with
for
money?
like full,
Quick,
full build out of the system.
Right.
Like, I think we had something like 8 different phases in our report. Some of them are pretty big chunks. I would assume that, you know, we're looking at more than a year per phase. So if you put it in that context, like 8 years, again, that's full build out, right?
Mhm.
You're not, maybe that's not the way you.
I'm just trying to understand what we're undertaking. if we
Yeah,
were to go.
yeah, no,
Timeline.
it's a big undertaking, like I would say, you know, some of your phases would be kind of long-range planning, right? When you look at it that way.
What would be the earliest time that we would be expecting to turn the tap on?
That's a good question. I would say, let me see.
And I have a follow-up question to that as well.
Yeah. I think it's early to say what
Yeah,
it
yeah.
would be like.
We're not holding you
You
to
know,
any time
I would
right here.
say you're looking at like 5 years time, right? But that would be part of like one of the next steps that we have up there is the
Okay.
conceptual design study. That's when you would really look at your prioritization, your phasing, your timelines. You know, right now, I'm just looking kind of like, oh, you know, we're looking at so many $1 million,
Mhm.
say 5 years, right? But that's what that study is for.
Right. So my follow-up question is, like, is there a clear priority of where we would start turning the water on? Like, knowing that our storage tank, regardless of which solution,
Yeah,
is likely gonna be at the end of, up that.
Yeah.
That area of town.
yeah. Right now, I wouldn't say there's a clear priority area. I think you would want to look at kind of, you know, how are you gonna make back your money? So,
Yeah.
you would wanna kind of balance those, like, are we aiming to serve the industrial zones? Because we think that's where there's like,
And
kind of a demand, and that's where we're gonna get our money back for our infrastructure investment? Or are we looking at hitting the closest residential zone because it's the highest number of users? So those things need to be ironed out, so at this stage in the project, it's not clear, yeah.
And having said that, is there a good handle on the fact that your 1,000 connection points, well, maybe over time that would happen?
Yeah.
Currently, they're all already on their own personal wells.
Right.
So is there a value proposition to spending $1,200 to $1,800 a year versus maintaining the current infrastructure they already have?
Yeah, so I think that's something that will be for you to look at and determine if it's worth your time. You know, as part of our study, we're looking at the technical points,
Yep.
but I think it's important for you to look at, you know, is it,
The
you
investment.
know.
Yeah, most
investing?
municipalities that have water infrastructure charge the resident if they're on a well. Yeah, a fixed fee, yeah.
So typically, there's like a grace period, right? So your water system starts up and, you know, is it 6 months in a year? I don't know. But after a certain point, whether they connect or not, municipalities will just say, charge now, you have access to the water.
The argument for that would be essentially if I'm hooked onto a well, everyone in my neighborhood hooks on, and then 20 years down the road, my well goes dry. And I say, okay, now I want to hook into the town's water. Well, throughout the whole, that 20 years, the municipality is responsible for maintaining that water transmission line to make sure that in the event, that would essentially be the argument that would be made. But it would be a policy decision around council as to that grace period and what that would look like. It would be essentially similar to the current existing sewer user charge bylaw. There would be one for water. And then if we were to start those phases, it would be a decision of council for that grace period and what that would look like, but. Yeah.
And currently now, if you have access to sewer, but you're on your own septic, you still pay your yearly sewer. So there's a few houses that do.
There's not more people beating on the doors here, but. Okay.
So I guess we already sort of touched on it, but I guess next steps, if you're interested and that's the choice to move forward with a new water system. Assuming it would be the village-owned source option, which was the lower cost.
Mhm.
So a geophysical survey, this would allow to refine the target location. So right now they're large zones, but the geophysical survey would allow them to be narrowed down to more specific study areas. And select an actual drilling target within those areas.
Does that include the actual drilling? Or,
No, so the geophysical survey is just to establish the drilling targets. The drilling would happen during the EIA phase.
okay,
Yeah, so that's the second item is the EIA and water supply
Oh,
source
okay.
assessment. So which includes the EIA registration document, drilling test wells, you know, if you need to build an access road, it would be done under that phase as a preliminary access road, a rough road to get the drill rigs in. Test drilling, pumping tests, and then, you know, the engineering or the hydrogeological assessment of the test results.
So how would that look? Would we proceed with a primary source first and explore that to an end, either it's good or it's not? Or would you look at all of the different zones at the same time and determine which one's best?
So I think with your geophysical survey, it would be worth your while to, if, you know, if funds permit, to investigate at least two of the zones. Maybe the third zone is not a high priority initially if, you know, if you've got two good zones. For drilling, typically the approach is to take it a couple wells at a time, you know. You select your most promising zone and you're gonna drill a well or two depending on what the target is. You know, it's always good to have a well and a backup well as a minimum. You're a large community, so maybe it's more than that, right? So large in the small community sense.
so I assume that we would be needing to do that on private property. Would we need to procure the,
There would be land use agreements needed for sure, yeah. A typical approach is to, you know, get landowner agreements in place for your testing phase. If the wells are, you know, good and you are gonna proceed with a water supply, or you wanna secure that well, that's when you would look at maybe purchasing the land. You know, each community is different,
Is that land purchase part of that, assessed price for the source?
we're at such a high level, you know, if we're saying it's 63 million, you could probably assume that your land purchase could be in that, but like, it's not gonna be eligible for funding, so typically it's not a large. You're looking at, you'd be hoping to pay the assessment value, so you're right, so. It all depends on how the negotiations go, so you can't necessarily predict with that.
and I assume there's also no sort of guarantee that we're actually gonna find water with the
That's right.
survey.
You can, you know, we're doing all the studies that we can to give you your best shot, but there's never any guarantees when you're doing that, yeah.
So we could spend the money on a geophysical survey and end up still needing to connect them up to.
It's a
Potential.
possibility, it's possible. Yeah, so I guess the last two items we've already kind of talked about, so, yeah.
So what is kind of the cost of that initial study, that initial phase, I guess?
So, in our phasing, we called it kind of phase one, the water, exploration and development, it's around 1.8. So it's kind of.
Do you mean the first phase or the geophysical?
Well,
Oh.
all of the
Whatever
pieces
phase
that
one
she
is.
just described.
So like all of the items on the previous slide, I guess.
The
Yeah.
exploration and well development's like 1.8 million.
Yes, excluding the land purchase,
Okay.
because again, like, when we're looking at funding, that's not an eligible cost, so it's not really.
Okay, so the well exploration is 1.8 million.
Mm.
With no real guarantee of,
Right.
okay,
And I think Laura, sorry, go ahead.
Nope.
I was just gonna say, Laura, you are or have worked with, like, I won't name them specifically, but communities in the area that have spent significant amounts of money to explore sources and have not found them, correct? Yes and no?
You can say yes, I guess.
Okay.
They have found sources that maybe are not necessarily, that the quantity of water
Okay.
may not be what they were hoping for.
Okay.
Or it may take more
Well,
tries
Okay.
than, you know what I mean? So you always hope that you get it on the first shot. There's always a chance that you wanna go back for, okay, well, we tried this target, but that didn't work out. Well, we've put this much effort in, let's try the next promising target. Sometimes that's a successful patient. And again, like, there's never, I can't promise, I can't make promises, right?
There's definitely, all that to say, it's a reality, like, it's a potential.
Yeah. it
Sorry.
is.
And how different is the EIA process if we decided to connect to Moncton?
So if you're connecting to Mountain, we've assumed that an EIA would be required more based on the chance that you're going to impact wetlands. We would have to discuss with the province to see if they would also have that trigger. So it depends on, it's always a good approach to reach out to the department first at your initial stage of the project, just to confirm their requirements, I guess. But we've assumed at this stage that the trigger would be the likelihood that you're crossing wetlands. That is a different trigger, but a lot of the tasks remain the same. So no matter where you're going, whether you're doing your own source or you're doing a city source.
Okay.
We need to protect the wetlands, and, a lot of the environmental considerations are similar. But if you're going for the City of Moncton source, you may not have to follow the WSSA process, which is how we test the water works,
Okay.
right? The water source. So the likelihood that they would require that would be lower because it's not your.
Okay, and if we're connecting to Moncton versus our own source, is there a difference in when we would, in timing? So would we see taps on sooner or be finished sooner? Or is the project about the same, milestone similar?
I would say it's similar milestones. It may be a little bit sooner, but you also have that long transmission main, so it may balance out the
Yep.
initial study phase in terms of duration, yeah.
Even without, if like an EIA isn't required to
Yeah.
like an extent, would you need the AIA stuff done? Like the archaeology part of it?
It's hard to say, like, typically the archaeological requirements come through the EIA. Yeah. Unless it's somehow someone triggers the project as having higher risk, but typically that comes through the EIA process. Yeah.
Okay, so my question is for you, and I don't know if this is the right time to ask questions, but I have questions about the current situation, and I don't think that's so much your department as your department. Is this an okay time to talk about
Yeah.
that, or are we gonna have another
Yeah.
discussion about?
No, I think, there's
Okay.
some answers we may not have, but.
Right, so I guess I need to pull this back to where a child would understand what's happening currently. So everyone is on a well, they own their wells, we do not support the wells in any way. So there is no way to know whose are super old and are at risk of drying up. There's no way to know if they're going to collapse. We're just kind of like, we don't know if we're gonna have water forever.
Six of my neighbors have had theirs replaced.
Right, so we've seen it happening around us, but we don't do anything to help with that, or it's not part of our asset management plan, I guess, is like the basis of where I'm going. So the real goal of this is expansion, right? Like, this is where I'm having a hard time, is like, the expansion needs to happen on Fredericton Road.
Industrial.
Tank is over here. I'm just having a hard time logistically. And so everybody's gonna have to connect to it, but I'm just having a hard time wrapping my head around it. I see the benefit. I know we need it. I get it.
The tank has to be at the high spot. That's the
Yeah.
reality. That's
Yeah, I don't super care about that. I guess what I'm really having a hard time wrapping my head around is how do we sell this to people? Cause some people aren't gonna care
that.
about.
It's not so much the carrying as the
Yeah.
cost that they have to pay all of a sudden. I think that's where your bigger problem is going to arise.
I assume their care is attached to a dollar value.
Yeah.
So,
And their carrying would go up when they have to have their own well and pay a water bill, in my opinion.
So for your specific question, like on the wells, that's correct, we don't, and there's no, when they're private wells, it's private testing or
Mm.
lack of testing, which is another
Right.
element too, so there's
Right.
no real understanding of what the quality necessarily is.
Mhm.
Other than when we, which the next presenter can probably speak to as well, when it comes to a development process.
Right.
Anytime that there is, something that goes to the commission for a permitting process or for a zoning, whatever it may be, it generally triggers a water study needed, whether it be comprehensive, or an abbreviated one.
Right.
And so that's the most understanding we have of the wells when we have an abbreviated or comprehensive study done. So there's that challenge with it too, of that, since we don't own the assets, there's very limited that we actually know from
Right.
them. And it is something for the expansion piece, because I would say it's an inhibitor to growth, is
Right.
the biggest challenge
Yes.
that we see in here.
That in and of itself isn't a problem, though. It has more to do with who's going to pay for the benefit.
Correct.
And if currently residents aren't really benefiting due to the fact that they have their own supply, the main beneficiary is going to be industrial, commercial.
It would be.
They should pay the lion's share of some of the annual costs associated until such time that the residents are going to take,
Are you allowed to have a differential water fee?
I assume so, volume based.
Like
Yeah.
You can,
it's-
you
So-
can
so-
meter.
Feedering it is
Well, the
like
city of
your,
Moncton
okay.
also does different fixed charges depending on your entrance into your property.
okay,
It'd be good to get an understanding as well. I know just in my subdivision, quite a few residents are paying for water filtration. Today, paying $400, $600 a year for that currently. So it would be good to get an understanding of that.
But there is no real demand residentially currently being clamored for, is there?
People aren't asking us to install water
Okay.
systems
And-
residentially.
Yeah, and I will say the last 3 years have been fairly unique from a water in terms of lack of rainfall and lack of
Yeah, I can just always speak for, again.
reasoning,
individuals with
well,
filtration.
drying up to a point.
Yeah,
It's,
and desalinating their coffee makers and the different things just because the water and that type of thing. So
but are they willing to pay $1,200 to $1,800 a year
I
to
can't.
enjoy that privilege?
right.
Or lack thereof? Again, more information I think needs to be
Absolutely.
acquired.
But I would just hate to like prolong this, like the last
It's
one
just
was
gonna
done
get
in
more
two
expensive.
thousand nine, now we're still talking
Yeah,
about it, but
absolutely.
at some point, somebody's gonna have to say, we need it. Or we're just gonna stay this size forever.
We're doing it now and
Yeah.
it's costing almost $30 million more than it would have cost us
Right,
in 2000.
And
Right.
then pretty well paid for by now.
So then even on development, we've seen development on the cost per roads to put in, and because with wells, you can only
Right.
put so many pieces of property in from a land test perspective as well.
I think
So there's a lot of different factors for sure.
To me, it's the demand. If the commercial and industrial users are interested in signing water agreements today to help expedite the development of a water system, that makes to me a lot of sense.
Question.
So what if you were to develop it in such a way that you build your water tower, you get water to the industrial area at the Franklin Road, and you stop? What kind of cost are you looking at that point?
Well, because it's a utility, that entire annual operating cost has to be paid for by.
But you're also cutting down the cost of all the
Distribution.
Oh,
distribution
true,
network.
true.
You cut down your distribution phases.
It's more that you would delay some of those
Right,
phases until such time as the demand.
That's right.
Yeah, and permanent stop, I mean, stop for the time being, until you
Yeah.
bring your water to new developments, bring your water to
That's right, yeah.
need areas.
We have to think about if this is a 5-year turning the tap on, is it already developed at that point? Like, what does it look like, right? We have to think about all that stuff.
5-year would be like the first
The
phase.
first,
right?
yeah, the
Yeah.
first people are turning on your
Yeah.
tap, right?
You know, the high
Hopefully they're at
level
the
might be a
highway.
big difference on,
Yeah.
because I always anticipated it starting at the big stuff area.
In my mind, I always saw it starting at the hill and flowing down and then us stopping it at the train tracks and saying, here you go.
Yeah.
But it's not,
That'd be true if you get water up there.
right,
It's sort of like that, right? But you have to put in all the piping.
right.
And there's a lot of cost to that.
Yeah.
Is there any way for us to know which neighborhoods are at risk of having cascading well failures?
No.
Like I know in my neighborhood, I've had lots.
Yeah, I'm not familiar off the top of my head. Are you by chance? Cause you could
Would be
maybe
permits,
make
right?
assumptions
Would
with
be-
well logs, but I don't think that would give us any tangible information because it depends. Every area, even within like the former village boundaries, some are at a certain depth, some are at another, some may collapse, some may run dry.
You can have a well right next to the other one, that one's salt and one's
Yeah.
not, or one's low, one's
Yeah.
high.
Based on depth, just
Yeah.
where the veins of water are.
Yeah.
Just
Just
altitude.
wondering if there's ways that we can prevent people from spending $20,000 to drill a well when a water line is gonna go past their house in 2 years.
You're still gonna need water for 2 years. There's no,
No,
there's no,
I get that, but
yeah, there's,
you know, if there's a
unless
way
you're
that
gonna
we,
share with your neighbor.
if there's a way that we can prioritize the areas with meaningful data that
Yeah.
would tell us which areas are at risk of,
And like when I say 5 years, that's like minimum 5 years.
Yeah, yeah.
right? Minimum. Keep that in mind, so.
You said 5 years and I've already in my head said 10. It's gonna have to be 10.
I'm hoping for 4.
More realistic is like,
Yeah.
that's best case scenario,
Yeah.
right? Like if you get your funding
Right,
right away, you don't, take any breaks, you truck right through.
right.
That's probably not, I'm looking at the amount of money you can spend and how quickly you can get things in the ground, but like realistically, I think you're probably.
I have trust
On
issues
the
with
right
engineers, I
track,
guess, is my
right?
issue. Just.
I don't wanna get your hopes up, right? I don't want you to think that in 5 years, everyone's gonna have water. We're
Yeah.
looking at 5 to 10 years to the first person with the water.
Just out of curiosity, what is the reasoning behind that? Because some of that stuff can be done, not necessarily in series, but can do it in parallel. There
Could
should
be
be,
done concurrently,
Yeah.
so if you had multiple contractors working,
a tank can be built at any point.
That's
things
right.
Can be started at any
That's
point.
right.
Money.
More just trying to think things through on a kind of realistic level. Most communities aren't necessarily gonna spend 30 million in a year, so, we're looking at the different phases. I'm looking at chunks, we got 12 million or so for the transmission line. Okay, well, yes, that could happen while your tank's being built, but I don't know if it will. Just trying to keep a
But
good perspective.
But even if it's a Moncton source or our own source, the transmission line up to 112, there's no reason why that wouldn't be able to be started at any point. It's gonna be there regardless.
Is it
There-
going up
there's-
the 112 or is it going across the back?
We assume it goes, I don't know what the 112 is, but.
What was it? Trying to remember from reading it.
Pumping went up from.
I'm not sure that you would necessarily start building your line until you know what your source is, even, right, like, if you're gonna have your own source, you're coming from the Kodiak Way, you're coming from.
But there's residents on both sides of that, so to me, portion of it, a big portion of it, you're gonna have on both directions anyway.
Cost here.
Just through like. through the prevention. I don't know if you would, need. I don't know if you would run the risk that something happened, I guess that would be your call, right?
so the line that would come from Moncton, if we connect it to the Moncton water source, does every house along that road have access to that water, or is it a different line?
You would assume that it's probably
This
gonna
is
be a
clear.
strict transmission line.
Your house
At
is up
least
here,
a
almost up to the highway.
good chunk of it, because
So then your water's gonna run straight across to the.
at a certain point, you're gonna start monitoring water quality, and it's probably not gonna be right at the boundary of
Yeah.
the city of Newton, so it may not be worth your cost to start connecting people right there. It would be something that would be worth looking at in your first study, but I think you're more likely to start connecting people once you get to a more populated area.
What would the likelihood be that the portion from where the current supply ends to the line of the city of Moncton, would they pay for themselves due to their own future plans?
Yeah, because there is a gap there, right? From where the water
Probably
transmission
a
line
whole
ends to our boundary.
I don't know what the likelihood is. I don't
Like
know.
that
how
would go to
much
their own future goals.
Like, I think it would be tied to potential development and
Because they would get,
they've got any.
Yeah. because they would realize any service fees associated with that themselves, so they would provide the benefit, they should have to pay for some of that.
Be a good discussion to have, yeah.
Part of negotiations.
Yeah, that's right, definitely.
Question for you. So the water exploration and well development, 1.8 million, not an eligible cost as part of the project. So do we budget for that? Is there grants for that? Do I get a debenture for that? Like,
I know that it's very challenging to get any
Yes.
of it funded.
oh,
Like,
it
that's-
is, okay,
it's
so
very,
there's
very
no
challenging.
like, RDC's not throwing money around at anybody, like, I don't even
They
know.
don't like-
I'm just picking random provincial
It,
programs
yeah,
up in the
it
air.
would come from RDC because if we were to unlock or tap into any funding, it would be through the IBA, like
Okay.
through with the feds, so the
Yeah.
CIP, the Investing in Canada program. And they, as in other levels of government, don't like funding projects, especially of that level, if there's no guarantee in return for them to say there are X amount of people tapped in, there
Okay.
are X amount of kilometers of water. So for
Right.
them to fund exploration, like well drilling, is it impossible? Maybe not. Is it unlikely? I would say yes. So I think those would be part of the conversations that we may explore, but
Right.
through the general, like IBA, through the same program that we would get water main line funding for, it would not cover
Right.
exploration. Yeah, so we would have to explore what that might look like. Like there
Okay.
may be other opportunities, avenues, even through other funding mechanisms like FCM.
Yeah,
They want
Okay.
like taps to turn on. So that's generally when you can unlock more of those
Okay.
funding mechanisms.
okay.
So you had quoted a price of 300 and some odd thousand for bulk water purchase. Like, is that a current rate of water from the city of Moncton? Or is that a projected, what the rate will be in 10 years?
It's on current, I would have to
Yeah.
check if we bumped it. I would probably put some factor on there. I don't know that it would be enough to cover you for,
30 years.
30 years.
Yeah.
That's also part of negotiations, so I believe,
Yeah.
right? That
Yes,
can-
absolutely, yeah. Just a ballpark figure at this point.
Where I'm struggling a little bit is if we have, let's use the middle, like 8 years or 8 to
Mhm.
10 years. We are paying a lot of money between now and then without getting any revenue from anyone.
That's the risk of a utility though.
Yeah.
Or maybe not the risk, the actuality of a
I guess
utility.
that's where my thought was on that, like, unless, I know we're gonna talk about this stuff probably in another 2 or 3 meetings or more. But when you think like the development up by the big stop, there's like a lot of room there right now, but in 10 years, there may not be any. And what does that look like? And
If there's no water, the chances are there still will be lots of room there in 10 years, right?
although they can have their own tanks and stuff, right? There's ways around it.
It's limiting to.
There is ways.
The business is limiting.
More attractive, put it that way.
Right.
More attractive, but there's ways, because we've seen ways in other meetings.
It's very expensive though,
I know, but
like very cost
We just-
prohibitive.
I guess can't assume there won't be a bunch of things up there already in 10 years. So it's just trying to think through.
I think history.
What that look
I
like.
think as soon as you put a water tower there, people will see that there's something coming.
We've already had business indicated.
Will
from
there
this
be a water tower up here?
Not a big stop area, but
The storage.
at the top. of-
Will you be able to see it from the big stop? How tall? Well, I mean, I know it's big,
You'll-
but like.
you'll see it. The map shows it's right by the.
And my vote.
I'm not visualize the town that well.
No, it's okay.
Yes.
You don't need to,
It
if that's not your
depends-
job.
it depends on, elevations and.
Right. Nathan, will I be able to see it from the big stop?
Yeah.
It could be, yeah.
Okay.
You know,
Um,
the question I have on that particular item, is that a fixed thought on where that tank should be? Because my understanding is there's actually a higher point than the 70-meter point that's.
It could be refined. It was selected for a starting point, but
I just know
It's
that,
not designed, there's definitely room for adjustment.
I just saw on your map, you had it end at
Yeah.
the old highway, the Homestead and the
Yeah.
Fredericton Road. That
Yeah.
easement all along that old highway is a lot wider than having to go through the farmer's field that is currently suggested.
No, there's definitely some design work to be done, and I think the point that we wanted to convey was the elevation, but if there's a better point, then, those same
Well, it's a point,
concept design and.
it's a higher point, but it's also for future development as well, based on demand and need.
Yeah. And that's like, again, we're doing this study to
Preliminary.
give you a ballpark
Yep.
value, right? So we're looking at, is it 75 million or is it, 50 million? We're not necessarily looking at, is it 75 or 76 or, so. Again, the same thing with the concept, we're looking at, okay, you need a tank, it needs to be roughly this elevation, like, yeah, there's definitely some room for adjustment, yeah.
How do you go under the highway?
That's a great question, actually.
Like with,
Drill or you put it along the bridge.
Could be an option,
Okay.
yeah, it would have to be evaluated, there's some, there are ways to
There's
put
already-
pipes on bridges and there is always directional drilling.
There's already sewer going through there, isn't there? Yeah. Because the big stuff has sewer going across the bridge,
yeah, that would have been done
or whatever that,
during construction of the highway, right?
Not on the bridge, it's below.
is that under?
So what's next steps for us? Like, do you bring a recommendation? Like, what does it look
So
like
there
for
are
us now?
some, I guess, depends on where council wants to go. Like council's decision could say, we want to sit on this. Council's decision could be, we want to proceed with the geophysical, which is the next, which would be the recommended next step to explore own source, would be basically the next kind of piece. That can take a while because that initiates potentially an EIA process is our understanding. Initiates, apologies, further services retained for an engineering firm and also landowner negotiations and conversations just to get access
Mhm.
to be able to do the surveys. So if essentially, long story short, is if council wants to proceed to continue to go further than at least the feasibility study, the next step, the next recommendation would be the geophysical surveys. Our position is that if 10 years down the road, council still wants to have this conversation, we would recommend doing the geophysicals because otherwise we're gonna be at the same spot as we were in 2009 and the studies
And then
that
you're just spending
predated.
more and more money on studies.
Exactly.
To update them, okay.
And 10, 15 years down the road, we'll be in the same position. Doing geophysicals and finding a water source does not mean that we will proceed with a water source, but
Right.
it could mean that we protect an area for a water
Right.
source if we
Okay.
know, yeah, this is a good area, we should protect it.
Okay.
The cost of the geophysical is it's substantial because all this is substantial. But with the reallocation that was approved by council at the last meeting, March 13th, so the last regular council meeting, there is enough funds to explore two of them, so two of the three. And because we had a small amount budgeted, we requested a small amount from the facilitator to include in the budget for this year, knowing that we'd have this report and not knowing what would be next, and assuming that it would entail costs. So we have that small amount plus funds that were reallocated from the extra line that was added to the transportation budget. So it's still a former village subunit expense. So those are there. So based on the conversation this evening and potential direction, that will be the next step, is we would come back with basically a proposal from the engineering firm to continue. They have a formal quote from a firm that does the specialized geophysical surveys, and then we would start that process. I'm not even sure how long that would take because it could take a long time depending on where the EIA requirements are and landowner pieces.
One of the initial steps would be to submit a detailed plan to the province saying that, this is what we're proposing. We don't think that an EIA is required, we're looking for your confirmation that we're able to proceed without the EIA. So assuming that they say yes, then, we go ahead and schedule things, you're gonna start your landowner discussions, et cetera. If they do say, no, you need to submit your EIA, well, then we need to talk, right? Because there's definitely different budget impacts when we start talking about.
So I'm gonna repeat that back to make sure I heard what you said correctly, is that we have enough money in the 2023 budget to cover exploration of 2 of the 3 zones that have been identified.
Just geophysical.
Geophysical,
That's
no,
why I asked.
Geophysical
geophysical
studies,
surveys.
surveys. I'm gonna write that down, geophysical surveys.
Yeah.
I didn't spell it right, but that's
Are
okay.
those studies dependent on the time of the year, or could they be done at any time?
I don't think you would want to do them with a lot of snow cover.
Mhm.
It's a very, those studies are very much on the hydrogeology side, so I would defer to my hydrogeologist, but I don't think you would want to do them with a lot of snow cover. I don't think there would be necessarily other time of year constraints.
So for your, I just pulled up the CRF specifically, so, the estimate that we were given for 2 zones, would be 75,000 plus HST, so we had 30,000 budgeted. And we're authorized to reallocate an additional 50,000 from that transportation line that we reallocated at the last council meeting. And then we would have the existing engineering professional services, fee that we could use for a portion of the actual engineering costs.
Okay,
I'll just pipe up that, recommend a little bit of a contingency allowance.
Yes, that's
because,
right, yes,
So
yeah.
That,
Yeah.
that's a very tight figure, so I
Yeah.
would add it. 15%.
But it begs the question, if we're more interested in the getting from City of Moncton side of things, does it make more sense to put some of those funds towards City of Moncton side versus going down the road of trying to determine if we have our own water supply?
And we would use that essentially there would be more, it would be engineering work, more kind of detailed costing plans that would be required, and we wouldn't be able to go into a meeting without the engineering firm with us, because we would not be able to have conversations at that level with their engineering department. So we would just basically reallocate that, and we would still come to council with a formal, in a regular meeting, would come with a formal recommendation as to what that may look like.
So having said that, are we at the point where we just have to make a decision if we're gonna do it, and then therefore, if we're gonna do it, which version we wanna go with before we spend money going down one road or the other?
I wouldn't say that you're cornered into making a decision right now, but
Oh.
yes. Philosophically, or from a council perspective, it's where do we want to go? Do we want to take the risk? First of all, do we want water? If we do we want to take the risk of doing our own source, or do we want to explore conversations with the city at a higher cost? That's the decision right now that's up in the air. And obviously it's not something that has to be done right now. It's just that there are those funds available. Like that's
but
right
with
now.
this amount of money, do these geophysical surveys, will we be able to grasp from those if any of the farmland around the area that we want to go to is gonna be affected?
Yes.
Yes and
I
no,
wanna hear from the
let's say.
professional.
Let's say yes and no, so you'll know, where this more specific targets are, so recommended targets for drilling. We won't necessarily know definitively if the farms are inside or outside the future
Okay.
wellfield protection zones. I'm not sure that there's a way to like definitively say that
Okay,
one way or another until that study is done after pumping tax and after the commissioning, basically.
Would there be any kind of an indication of the likelihood of water? I'm assuming that there would be.
Well, I guess that's the purpose of the geophysical surveys, is to give you an idea of the likelihood of the water by understanding better what the ground looks like under the ground, let's say. To give you an idea of what the different thicknesses of,
Rock or whatever.
yeah,
okay.
depth of bedrock, basically, that kind of thing, so.
Just out of curiosity, is there any cheaper options of finding local aquifers, or is this basically what it is?
The alternative is to simply start drilling test wells in, areas of elevated potential, but that
Oh.
If that's the case. you
I've
don't
seen
have
that
a
not
lot
go
of
well in a park
information
here,
to go, Right? At this point, I think it's better to have the information to make more of an educated decision on where to start drilling. Right now, we're looking at it. So,
And just out of curiosity, you picked zones all next to the river. Is there any reason why you think the river itself has better potential for well water?
yeah, so, I guess I'm not the hydrogeologist, so I'll give you my interpretation of it, is that they're looking at, they call it bank filtration, so it's not directly drawing in surface water, because we know that surface water has more potential for contamination and treatment requirements, but it could be influenced by surface water, right? So that may help recharge the well, so it may be a little bit of a balancing act between water and surface water, but they are still considered wells. The impact of having the river so close would have to be, the water quality would be tested during the
Exploration phase.
phase. That is what the
So
hydrologist.
in the grand scheme of things, $75,000 to $100,000 isn't a lot. It's that 1.8 million to start drilling wells that's concerning.
But I'd rather spend this money.
Yeah.
To get an idea. Or I have to make a bigger decision.
It's almost like paying for insurance without ever needing to use it, right? But it's important. It's important
Yeah,
to
and-
have the extra
Yeah,
intelligence.
and I think the cost difference from our own well source versus Moncton, I think we probably owe it to the residents to make sure we're exploring at least the most least.
I would agree.
It's also beneficial to control our own future.
So when do we have that conversation? Is that in,
Conversation.
as a council to decide how we want to proceed? Is that in our next open council meeting?
Right now.
Okay.
So there's a couple options. So let's say council could come to you mean committee of the whole versus council?
Yeah, like we can't make any financial
Correct,
motions or anything like that here.
correct. But you already made the
But we
motion.
can,
Okay,
You made the motion to reallocate the
Right.
funds. But what would come to the next council meeting is, given the fact that it's such a large
Okay.
decision and a large file, we would come back with the formal, basically proposal from the firm to say we will do X, Y, Z, to direct staff to initiate conversations with the province, the engineering firm, and potentially landowners. And then the proposal would include basically authorizing the spend of the funds, because it's beyond what administration can spend, but the conversation in terms of where do we go, city, our own, nowheres at all, would be here. Or if it needs to be deferred, then we defer and have a conversation at another committee of the whole meeting, but it would be, the deliberation would happen at the committee of the whole meeting, the motions would happen at the regular council meeting.
I would move to defer for 1 month. I'd like to know a little bit more about the industrial commercial demand, and if they're willing to put anything on paper today to really justify that spend initially, knowing that's coming down the pipe.
The commercial users?
Commercial and industrial, if they're the main beneficiaries initially, and they're the main impetus for a lot of this to begin with, for growth of future need of water, then to me, they have to have some buy-in to whatever we are going to look into spending ahead of the residential side.
And I would think if we're going to go, move forward with making an actual decision on the system itself. So right now, we're talking about just the
geophysical surveys.
surveys, right? If we are going to move forward with anything else, we would want to have some sort of public consultation in general. Right? There would be a process, we would
Right.
decide.
that's included in the overall.
So it's legislated to have public consultations with EIAs, correct? So
Absolutely.
that would be when we would formally go through, this is what it would look like, this is what it would look like for the average homeowner, this is what it would mean, this is why we're doing it. But there's certainly, and obviously for geophysical surveys, there would be direct consultation with landowners for access to get the surveys completed. And then there's been some informal conversations with some of the users in that particular area, the Big Stop area, who have quantified a need by way of there's some that, we're basically saying we have to basically cut a check to do our own treatment system. There's some that have already done that to the tune of significant amounts of money. They haven't all been approached. These are the ones that have approached us before. And then from the residential development side, there are several that have said that they won't put shovels in the ground here. So we can have conversations with them to get something formal, and see what the appetite would be. But it would still be a lot of hypotheticals, I would say. But at least there would be some sort of indication, I would say.
I agree, but it's kind of determining the demand that we're gonna need. You're gonna need that demand regardless. Just to know what size piping to even put in, what size tank to put in. If they're going to draw a lot more than we realize initially, it just seems prudent to find out kind of where they're at. And any future development that may be taken into consideration as
And
well.
who do you go talk to for that?
And wouldn't that have been part of the study?
So
Estimated water usage?
there is estimated water usage. It's not based on like metered
Yeah.
data from specific, industries. But there are guidelines that we follow to be able to estimate typical water consumption, this type of industry.
There were also conversations, I think, at one point in time, correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, around including transmission lines for fire protection or not for fire protection, and these costs went to have sufficient like sizing for fire protection, is that correct?
That's right, yeah. So we know that there's not necessarily a need, coming from the community saying that we want to have fire protection, but at this stage, we've assumed that it's in the design.
An easy add-on.
Yeah, because, it's, are you putting a 250 or are you putting a 300 diameter pipe, right? Or I don't know the exact numbers there, but the incremental cost could justify it. If it wasn't something that you didn't want to have, could be reevaluated, but it's at this point, for the purpose of costing, it's in.
So you said the words "I move," and I don't think that was a formal motion,
Yeah,
right?
so do you want to put an actual motion to defer it? I can't guarantee we'll come back in a month, so I would just say that the motion would be to direct us to come
Can we
back.
make more than one motion on the
We can do
subject?
one at a time, right?
Yeah, it has to be one at a time. There can
But
be
we
several,
can,
but
yeah,
yeah.
okay.
So is that?
Yeah.
So to come back at a future council meeting?
In 1 month or within
I would
a
just say-
short period of time.
As quickly, as soon as they can.
What is the motion? Just so I'm.
To defer.
Defer doing this study. Defer,
She's gonna be more
I'm
information.
sorry, I don't want to put words in your mouth, so you go ahead.
Just defer till we have a little bit better understanding of what demand from the industrial commercial users are.
So you're asking to defer this, but requesting another study be done on a different topic of going to
Basically,
businesses.
yes.
Do you want,
Not so much has to be a formal study, but just,
like us checking with some of, okay.
you have to have some understanding of what we're
Sorry,
talking about from a volume perspective. And what they're willing to pay, because if they want all the water for nothing, that's nice, but the residents do not need to pay for their benefit.
So then,
Um,
sorry, so then for the record, we need to know the actual wording of the
Yeah.
motion, right? So the wording of
I
the
move
motion,
that we defer until further information has been garnered in terms of the commercial and industrial usage being proposed.
so moved by Councillor Dykstra,
Moved by Councillor Dykstra, seconded by.
yeah.
Ask again.
So,
Is there any seconder to the motion?
I don't know what, I don't know what the process is, like if you have
Just
questions.
ask
about
for time.
yeah,
There's no seconder.
Defeated.
So it's dead.
And I'll ask a third time, any seconder to the motion? That the motion doesn't move forward.
So having said that, are we making a decision then at the moment?
So I'm gonna put a motion on the floor,
Okay,
if I may. I move that council direct administration to continue working with Englobe Corporation to proceed with the geophysical surveys of 2 potential water source areas in order to continue the exploration of the feasibility of a municipal water system by bringing a proposal to an upcoming council meeting for approval. So moved.
Seconded.
By Councillor Thorne, seconded by Councillor Obelinas. Questions to the motion?
I have. I don't know if I have questions or comments. No, I don't think I do.
I just want to say, I get what you're saying, but I think that that's a next
Next
step
phase,
after this
right.
step. Like, I think you're jumping a step in the way I'm
Because
seeing.
there might not be any feasibility at all, right, for our own.
I feel like I just want to know if there's, just want to know this
Yeah.
before I do any more.
Yeah. And I would say that
Because of the cost
we've
difference.
delayed so much on this moving forward, that we kind of need to move forward, but
Oh, I agree.
I get what you're saying, because,
Why spend money on stuff you don't know the volume you're gonna have versus even what volume you need?
yeah, but I think I guess I would defer for different reasons. Not because I feel like we need more information, but I would be concerned that we have two counselors here who are probably gonna ask a lot of questions in the next council meeting.
Well, this isn't
It's just
being
bring a
vote, this is
proposal.
council of whole tonight, right?
It's just a different-
So it's gonna go back.
Exactly.
It has to be ratified at the next
At the
meeting, so
meeting,
then
right.
they can ask their questions there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like, I think it still
Right.
gives them time.
It's like
I'm not
very-
calling Laura tomorrow morning to say, okay, send them out,
Right.
go.
Yeah.
That's,
Right.
that
very
can't happen.
Sensitivity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to make sure there's like an understanding though. At the end of the geophysical, you will not know that there's water. You will just know where the targets are.
Sure.
Okay.
Two
Sure.
I just want.
Sometimes words come out of my mouth that aren't right, but I understand it in my head.
Just wanted to
Yeah,
make sure that
yeah.
you understood.
I appreciate you. Yes, thank you.
Sorry.
So how does the accounting work for an asset that would be under, similar to the sewer,
Like a
Where-
utility.
a utility? Where we have no revenue coming in, we're spending against a utility that doesn't exist yet.
You hold that debt.
Does it just sit there and it
Mhm.
eventually gets rolled over to the utility? So we fund it from the operating and then eventually roll it over to the utility?
Yes.
That's why there has to be,
Only.
further,
That is interesting.
in terms of actual like phasing, what that looks like we wouldn't know what that looks like until we had that formal analysis of the phasing done. Like, so we could say, okay, it's coming from this exact area after a test from here to here, the cost will be this. But you need to fund it in the meantime until you basically establish that utility, I guess, is the way to say it. I'm not sure exactly the wording, but yeah.
Until you
And
flip the
it-
switch on.
It's also like, I'm not sure from when sewer was explored, if it was even comparable. I'm not sure because it's been here for quite some time. And it's obviously a very different utility and conversation and cost. So it would be something that would be new for us too, I would say, that would be part of those conversations around phasing and funding applications, so on and so forth. So no direct answer right now.
Oh, I think you answered me.
Oh, there you go.
I just wanna say that I only disagree from the perspective that I'm not interested in looking at the supply side until we have a good understanding of the demand side. But that's.
I think it's fun when we disagree, so.
I enjoy it.
So the motion, just so I'm clear, the motion is the motion is to, give administration the go-ahead to bring back a proposal to our next council meeting
Mhm.
where we can all discuss and decide and vote.
I will call Laura tomorrow and say, I need a proposal for
Right.
these services. That's what I will do tomorrow. And then that would come, at the next council meeting, insofar as it can get pulled together by then. And then we would move forward pending ratification at that council. meeting.
Okay. Perfect.
Lovely.
Motion on the floor.
Okay, motion on the floor. All in favor?
Aye.
Contrary minded?
Nay.
The clerk's office has direction for the next council meeting.
Can I request a recess, please?
I'll second.
So
Second.
motion forward for a recess from Councillor Thorne, second by Councillor Colwell. All in favor?
Aye.
Alright,
Contrary minded? Sorry.
Just before we go to recess, I think Laura's all set, so just thank
Okay.
you.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Your information was very
giving you some, good technical point. No, awesome, that's
Yeah.
great.
Thank you for
Very-
answering all our questions.
Yeah.
I'm cutting into the pistachio squares.
Wait, we have to have on the motion, sorry, I
On the
interrupted, but
motion, all in favor?
Aye.
I'm reminded. Okay, we are now in. All right, may I have a motion to leave recessing and back into regular? So moved by Councillor Glant, seconded by Councillor Thorne, all in favor?
Aye.
I'm reminded, we're now back into the regular session. I'd like to welcome Lori Beckford from the Plan 360, who's going to give us a riveting presentation. We always enjoy you coming to our.
Riveting.
It's been a while, but so welcome to the town of Salisbury, and we're looking forward to having a good discussion this evening.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I do have my screen up. It's the exact same thing. I'm just worried that I'm not gonna be able to read that far away.
Do you wanna?
We're looking at the same thing essentially.
yes, you have it on your screen, right? Like you have your presentation on your screen?
Yeah, but it's not connected to you guys.
No, but just tell Diane.
We'll come along.
Yeah, we're all set, yeah.
So from my end, what I'm here representing Plan 360, which is a division of the South Regional Service Commission. And, but my primary focus on my presentation is gonna be the planning and development side of things. So please don't ask me about economic development or about Eco 360 because I'm not. Who we are, if you wanna look at the first one. So we have been in existence since January 1st, 2013. So prior to that, we were under a district planning commission model as well as a solid waste commission model. So that was dissolved at the end of 2012 and was replaced with the regional service commission model for the province. It did adopt 12 new regional service commissions throughout the entire New Brunswick. And the mandated services at the time were land planning, which is my particular division that I'm involved in, and the solid waste. So it's just some general background for you.
Sorry, too fast.
No, good job, good job. We're in sync. This is just giving you a snapshot of our region. So in the upper left-hand corner is the entire province of New Brunswick. The dark green being the region we look at. The thing I always like to point out about this particular slide is that we do have 25% of the population in the southeastern region, which certainly considering the mass of the province, that's a significant amount of people residing within the southeastern region. And then on the right is a breakdown of the individual municipalities under the new reform. We do have 10 municipalities in the region, as well as rural districts as well. We do not provide the land use planning services, though, to the city of Moncton or to Dieppe. We do provide them to the town of Riverview, though, and all other municipalities within the region. So I've circled you guys here in as entity number 33. So this map that you see underlined is essentially the development trends or building permit trends between 2020 and 2021. So you can kind of see where the hotspots are of development. So red and yellow being the more intense areas where we see building permits issued. Blue certainly, pardon me?
Shediac is busy.
They're very busy. So a lot of development happening in the last couple of years down in that particular region. But certainly by no means, I mean, you guys certainly have identified core areas on your map as well that show that there is development happening consistently over those 2 years. This is a screen shot of your latest stats as a new region. I do have copies of those printed for Diane, just because I'm not gonna, or Diane can circulate. I'm not gonna sit here and go through the stats, but it gives you a good snapshot of what Salisbury can consider as their population, their age diversification, as well as their general lodging and tax base. This is, oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Glad you're like on this. So this is our staff. Some of these people are no longer with us. We've had some changeover in staffing. However, this is kind of that core team that we would look at trying to maintain on the planning side of things. So, trying to strive for that 7 planners, 7 building inspectors and development officers compilation as well. Keep in mind that any planner is automatically a development officer. So there is some overlap between some of these particular positions. And then, of course, there is a trail coordinator that comes under our section, as well as GIS staff. So the GIS staff is the one that's looking at maintaining our mapping services. They're the ones that are creating these zoning maps for us and numerous other studies that require mapping. So our local mandate is that we deliver the planning and building inspection services for all of our partners in the Southeast region. So again, eliminating City of Moncton and DF. So we often have a significant amount of travel that we'll have to do from time to time. We have 4 offices, 1 in Riverview, 1 in Moncton, 1 in Shediac, and 1 in Sackville. So at any particular time, where any staff member could be moving throughout the Southeastern region. So I'm moving into the part of the presentation where I just kind of give some overviews of what the core things are that we deal with on a daily basis. So one of the things that you'll hear me talking about most often are our plan and our bylaws. And these are the land use bylaws that are in place in the region. So certainly these bylaws are council's bylaws. They're adopted by you. They are changed by you as well. But Plan 360 staff prepares the changes. They also prepare the content of them, as well as the day-to-day administration of them as well. So we do that on your behalf as part of our partnership. But under the New Brunswick legislation, there are 2 different types of planning documents that we would come into contact with. So we have a municipal plan and a zoning bylaw. So there are 2, but they are specific to certain types of municipalities. So the village itself, the predated village, was under a municipal plan and a zoning bylaw. The areas outside that village core were under a rural plan, which is essentially the same thing as a municipal plan and zoning bylaw, just put into one document. Still covers land use controls, still has some policies around directing future goals and that sort of thing. But as part of reform, now that you guys, this entire area is considered a town, you will eventually adopt a municipal plan and zoning bylaw that does encompass the entire region. So you'll be phasing out that rural plan over the next few years as time requires. We do have, under the legislation, 5 years to do that. Both of you guys, you're in a very good position in that the municipal plan and zoning bylaw were adopted in 2020. And then the
2021.
2021 before. It was a
Great, we're ready to.
it was a lengthy review process
One of
and
the first things we did, right?
Yeah.
very well done, I will say.
Yes.
But and then the Westmoreland Albert area, so your area outside that former village boundary, it was just recently adopted in 2022. So again, you're very current on your land use expectations in the region. So, oh, I had it right there on the slide. Once you do have these documents in place, you are required to review them every 10 years, but the review can range from, simply looking at it and saying, hey, everything still looks good, to our last exercise that we did with municipal plan and zoning bylaw, which was, looking at it in full detail, seeing if there was changes in the goals and objectives of development within the community, and where we seeing the future direction going. Your guys' water study would be one of those things that, to me, would be a crucial part to looking at your land use in the future. So depending on the direction you go there, that might really change the face of how you would lay out your land use in upcoming years. This is just a screenshot of your current zoning bylaw, or your current zoning map in the village area. And I'll call it the village area just to keep it separate. You'll see that there's a variety of zones that are within there, so it's considered your more urbanized center. The thing I do want to point out is that when you see the gray areas, those are your areas that are considered rural, so that's where we do not want to direct future growth right now. We want to focus it all on this, your serviceable boundary, so the dashed area. So that's all based on gravity-fed systems for sewage. So we want to direct people to take advantage, kind of that utilizing the services that are already in place, rather than have people invest in infrastructure on these large rural lots. So you want to try to recoup some of that money by encouraging them to develop in that area. This would be your zoning in the outlying areas, so you'll see there are fewer zone colors, which is normal when you get into more rural areas. The thing that gets a little bit convoluted in this particular case is you'll see that kind of gray streaming around the roads. That's looking at directing creation of lots on those existing public road systems rather than encouraging small lot development on new roads and new infrastructure outside the existing infrastructure that's in place.
Unless you're 200-meter minimum.
No, there wouldn't, it would be, so any of these gray ones would be your, what's considered a 1 acre lot would be allowed. Where you would get into the areas outside the gray, you'd be limited to a 5 acre lot.
Yeah, you could not divide any more than,
Oh, I see the road.
it'd be a minimum of 5 outside those areas.
Yes.
Okay.
Again, that idea of not investing in more infrastructure, so trying to,
Densification.
yes, exactly. So, oh, sorry, next slide. So kind of going along with those documents, we do from time to time review them and not review them, sorry. We do have people who make requests to amend them. Council may step in and try to amend them as well. So let's say next week you guys have the public water system in place. There's a lot of policies now that are outdated in here. So you would want to trigger a text amendment to go in and change that to make sure that those goals and objectives and the water study is properly reflected. Would remove some of the requirements nowadays to have water studies conducted on development, which is a cost that's incurred to developers when they come in to do any kind of subdivision, changing the density of property. It's automatically triggered that they have to do these either an abbreviated or comprehensive water study. So big decisions for the community when you're involving amendments. You don't want to get into modifying your land use policies and regulations too often though. But you do want to make sure that it's, yeah, and it's reflecting the community's goals and objectives. If you start amending too frequently, all of a sudden the stability of your land use is compromised. And, you know, that reliability of somebody purchasing property, thinking I can do commercial activity here, all of a sudden you go in and you change it to residential, well, they might be out, you know, a couple $100,000 on an investment that they made based on that zoning. But
Could you explain rezoning a little bit more in depth in terms of what process to how things are evaluated from a rezoning perspective in terms of, is it stakeholders that are taking some measurement in terms of that? Is it, what is the actual metrics or mechanisms in terms of rezoning?
it'll vary depending on what the rezoning request is for.
Yeah.
So, you know, if we look at the, you know, the most extreme one, let's say it's an industrial development, well, you're gonna have more stakeholders and more layers involved in that. You're gonna seek comments from other departments that might have a vested interest in that. When we get into eventually talking about, you know, expanding industrial areas up in here, one of the key things that we'll have to do is reach out to Department of Agriculture, because there will be agricultural lands affected by that.
Yes.
So they will be a stakeholder who will have a stake. You know, at the end of the day, it will be a council's decision as to whether they change it. But certainly I would suggest you don't blindly not listen to what professionals are telling you and what other departments are telling you. Because the last thing you want to do is, create a situation where you probably should have given a bit more thought to one particular segment than, just automatically changing it for that one little, that one person that's come in for you. And that's where rezonings get tricky because, when you come in, if you're doing a straightforward rezoning, which is I'm changing that rural land to industrial, well, any industrial activity that's listed in the permitted uses can go on that land now.
Yeah.
There are other types of rezonings that are conditional rezonings, so that's when you have a very specific proposal that comes through, and then you attach an agreement with it that says, it can be a detailed agreement that says everything right down to you have to develop it exactly like the plans that you provided.
Type of covenant, I assume.
They're stronger than covenants because it's a legally adopted bylaw, and it stays in force until council either revokes it or.
Rezoned it again.
The problem with doing conditional rezonings though, is you gotta remember that once you do the conditions, they're there. So if somebody wants to change after the fact, it's a whole public process again.
Yeah.
They are public processes though. So council is required first, whether it's a text amendment or rezoning, to first decide whether you want to consider it. So as part of that process, we would do up a preliminary report for you, kind of outlining everything. Council would say, yeah, we think we want to consider it. Not saying that you're going to do it, but that you're going to consider it. And then that would set a public hearing date. We have so many days under the act that we have to publish notification and that sort of thing. Sometimes we do notification to surrounding property owners as well. If it's a rezoning, if it's a text amendment, that applies throughout that particular zone, so that's not really something that you can go out and notify. Yeah. But we would invite them to a public meeting, and then like any other bylaw, you guys are required to do 3 readings of that bylaw at least 2 separate occasions. So quite a lengthy process. You're probably looking 3 to 6 months before you get into changing these. When you get into changing a municipal plan, automatically add an extra month on because you have an extra public presentation meeting that has to be done. So it certainly doesn't happen overnight, and which is good because again, you don't want to be changing those on the fly. You don't want to be changing it on an individual basis. You want to make sure that you've taken the time to fully assess that change to the bylaw. We do on our website have full interactive maps though of your zoning. So anybody, members of the public, council, can go onto our website, pull up your municipality. We're still using old regional names right now, or not regional names, old municipal names. That will change in the next
Update.
few months, but just taking us a little bit longer to get mapping aligned with documents and getting them sorted out. But essentially in the box lettered A, you can put in a civic address, you can put in a property identification number if you know that, and it'll automatically take you to the property. Once you click on the property, you can find out what the zoning is. Most of them, the hyperlinks are working, but because some bylaw changes have happened, some of our links have got broke, but at least it directs you to the proper spot to look in the particular municipal bylaw. And then the other one that I just marked for people is the one marked with the B, the little window icon that allows you to turn on that aerial imagery. Some people are better able to orient themselves once they actually see the building footprints on the ground. So certainly a very good tool to use. I use the website all the time. And we do keep it actively updated for any amendments that come through. So there is probably, a month delay after it gets registered, or could be up to a month. So keep that in mind, but generally at any given time, it's very active. The other thing that we do is subdivisions. So this is when you're taking a piece of property, cutting it into 2. Could also be putting in a 10-lot subdivision with a new public road. could also be taking two separate pieces that are side by side and putting them into one and consolidating it. It all still falls under that definition of a subdivision. So we do have a separate subdivision bylaw for that I'll talk in a few minutes about, what we will have to do in the near future. But we are actively doing subdivisions. So, and like I say, they range in complexity. Certainly, you know, the person that's joining the two pieces side by side together, that is gonna be a number of days for that to get approved versus somebody who's trying to build a, you know, one currently coming off Fredericton Road, the 14 lot subdivision with a new public road. You know, that is something certainly that takes longer than that. There's subdividers agreements that have been entered into. That to me is one of those things as well, though, that, you know, certainly going back to that water study aspect, you know, looking at that when new services come in, generally it's the responsibility of the municipality to pay for them. So if Fredericton Road had a sewer line already running up there, they automatically have to connect to it once it's in place, and they have to pay for that connection and hand it over to you guys when it's developed. So, you know, not all that infrastructure would have to be built by you guys. But certainly if they want to take advantage of the new infrastructure, which you would have worked into all your bylaws, they would be putting the bill, not you guys. So does have big development potential though for that area coming off Fredericton Road that, you know, you could be looking at decreasing lot sizes. So the advantage to a developer is they get a lot more lots out of that same road, stretch of road than they would get out of a single lot subdivision where they have to provide their own water service on it, as well as density. So, you know, you're into right now, density, they have to do their comprehensive water study. They have to ensure that they have enough water on that one property to accommodate that density on the property for a number of units. Whereas when you get a public system in place, that's not as much of an issue, but I'm not trying to sway you, just pointing out some points of how your land use will change if you go that route for sure. So these bylaws will be great right now, but going forward into the future, they would not be a reflective document to have if you had full municipal services. When you get into new streets at this level in the village core area, that is your guys' responsibility to accept those particular streets. Outside the village boundaries right now, though, it will be the minister who will accept those roads if there's a new road that gets built.
Okay.
So I don't know how long, right now they're saying that that will stay, but I don't know how long that will transpire before, you know, don't want to be a pessimist here, but, you know, it's a municipality, so. Yeah,
As
I'll
long
leave
as
it
they
at
have snow removal, I imagine they'll maintain the roads.
and, you know, that, as long as they keep those service agreements in place, then yes, it makes sense that they are the ones that should be deciding it. Generally, the pressure, out in those outer skirting areas though, right now is not really there. And that warp bylaw kind of really discourages the development of new public roads. So I don't anticipate that being an issue for you guys in the foreseeable future. We also do building permits and development permits, which make up the majority of the day-to-day work that we would do. So when we're issuing a development permit, as well as a building permit, every single development has to be reviewed to make sure that it complies with your zoning bylaw or your zoning regulations that are in place. If it doesn't comply, well, then it can't make it past the development permit process, and therefore it would never get a building permit process issued. So it's at that stage where we're looking for the setbacks, the proof that there's adequate water, that there's septic disposal, either through a public system or private. And we're looking at all those individual details. And again, they kind of range in complexity based on, you know, the type of use. You know, certainly your single lot house being built is not as complex as a big commercial or industrial development that's occurring. And the big thing I want to point out about building permits, because everybody always likes to complain that I shouldn't have to get a building permit, but what they are doing is they're ensuring that that construction is being built to the National Building Code standards, as well as it does protect the current owners and future owners of that property. So you always, anybody watch any of the home decorating shows, you always hear about people who went in and did these renovations without permits, and now all of a sudden the new person, you know, has to tear off a significant portion of the structure. So, you know, I just watched one on the weekend that there was a whole sunroom that was added without a permit, and they had to tear it down because there was never a permit issued for it in the first place. So it does make sure that it's built properly and meets all necessary requirements.
And that the property value is assessed at the appropriate level for taxation.
That does help too. But I will also point out, we do have things called demolition permits, which people often will just tear something down. And, you know, there's really, you're not gonna go chasing after them. However, it's to their benefit to come in and get a demolition permit because your taxes will be assessed again. So if you tear down an old house, now all of a sudden it's being assessed as a vacant property. So
That's good to know.
it's.
That is good to know.
I would-
Or you have one of those.
That's a big one.
If you- I'm not, but there's a lot of places out there where I see these big houses or big structures torn down and they didn't get a permit. I'm like, that's gonna be sitting on your tax bill for,
Forever.
yeah.
Wow.
We will get a demolition permit if we get there tonight.
They're only $25.
$25, there you go.
Money well spent. We do though, one of the things that you might hear some more complaints about, on the building permit side of things is we need proper plans to assess things. People sometimes get pretty creative of what they want to hand you and have you.
The hand drawings.
Yes, last year I have, you know, my worst one I seen was a pizza box. The guy did it in crayon and he didn't even use a ruler. I'm like, really? You think I'm going?
I appreciate the creativity.
Yes, I like that you attempted, but let's try to at least get some measurements in there and some scales. So, anyway, we do need proper plans and, you know, sometimes we get a little kickback. And we're moving more into a process of, in the last year or two, we've found that people were coming in and they were trickling pieces of information in. So they would give me, you know, one piece, they'd go away for 3 weeks and then they'd call back and they'd be like, well, where's my permit? And then staff have to go back and review every single thing only to give them the same list and say, okay, well, you crossed one thing off, now here's what you need. We're moving more into a system of here's what's required. Get that information, come back to us, and then we can process your request properly. It just becomes a time management scenario. It also becomes confusing for some people. This will be the only, they might only do this process once in their lifetime. So I understand how they can get confused and think, oh, because she gave me a signed piece of paper that means I've got a permit. Well, no, it doesn't. Like, unless you have both these documents in your hand, you do not have the actual go-ahead start. So
Checklist is a good thing.
yeah, so this year, we've really concentrated on improving those checklists so that there's a nice, they look a little intimidating at first when people see them because there's quite a lot of things on them. But really, when you digest it, most people are providing that stuff pretty quickly. And so the other thing that we do, which is one of my favorite parts of the job, is the complaints and contraventions. So, you know, this ranges on a day-to-day from, you know, neighborhood conflicts that are happening. You know, some cases are civil disputes between two property owners and we really can't help them. Sometimes they are full-blown contraventions to the bylaw though. So if somebody might be doing an activity on the property that they're not allowed to do, or they might be, you know, they might have started to build without a permit. See them all. So it's, generally speaking, we like to take the position that somebody is not necessarily full-blown guilty. So we like to start with a notice of infraction, just kind of that, I call it the nice letter. I'm sure somebody who receives it probably doesn't call it a nice letter, but at the end of the day, it's advising them that they're in contravention of a bylaw, because sometimes people just don't know and they don't realize, or, you know, everybody's told them, oh, well, if you leave one wall standing, you don't need a building permit. Well, you do. So, so yeah, it can be just kind of miscommunication. So we try to work through them. Sometimes though, we cannot get, yeah, then it moves on to the nasty letter, and it's a deadline that's, you have X amount of time. It ranges between 14 and 60 days that we give them under the act. Depending on the severity of it, if it was something that was life-threatening, we're gonna give you 14 days, right? If it's something that's, you know, time sensitive, maybe it's the wrong time of year for them to do some activity to rectify the situation, we might stretch it out longer. But our active goal in the whole thing is to try to get conformity without going to court, because nobody wins when we go to court. It becomes a big expense to you guys. If you win, you usually get your money back, but even then, it's not gonna cover the full expense of what you went through. Not gonna cover my costs, but, that's a service that we provide to you guys anyway, so. So yeah, we try to avoid going to that route. So sometimes these contraventions will stretch out a little bit longer than everybody hoped. But if it works out that we don't have to go the court route, it's worth it in the long run. But before we go to court, so I do my nasty letter, the order to comply. If I fail to get an order to comply response out of them after that time frame, I write up a letter of recommendation for council to seek further legal action against them. And then that goes before you guys, and you guys make the decision to do the expenditure. We step in to aid through the process, but your lawyer takes the main active role in it. And with us, there is advisors on what had been done, the bylaw expertise behind it and that sort of thing. But I do strongly advise that when something comes to you, do not just look at it as a dollar sign, and that we don't want to spend the money to rectify it. Because if it's a contravention that goes unnoticed and unchecked for a long period of time, all of a sudden there's the trickle effect that starts happening, and other people say, hey, well, they were allowed to do it, well, I'm gonna do it. And then the next thing you know, you've eroded away that whole point of doing land use planning and protection of your surrounding community. Before I continue on too, I do want to point out that you guys do any of these things that I'm talking about that we do on your behalf. That money is collected by us, but it's completely returned 100% for application fees back to you guys. You pay us a bulk fee every year for the planning service, and in really good years, if your numbers are good, you actually we actually pay you to do services for you. So certainly when you, I know one of the things we've been talking about is building permit fees and the building bylaw. You know, if your building permit fees are set right, especially when you hit commercial and industrial activity, we just had a huge institutional one in Sackville that was the permit value, so not the construction, but the permit value was $157,000. So they can add up, and certainly not something that you should be walking away from.
As long as the bylaw, the zoning is structured properly to accommodate all the.
Well, we would never get to connecting the fee, to charging the building permit fee if it wasn't for the zoning, right? So, but certainly your building bylaw is important for making sure that the fee that you've set is realistic of the scope of work that's being done and the future tax base. That's
Not a deterrent as well.
in our experience, I have never seen somebody say, I'm not gonna pay the $500 on a permit to build this $200,000 structure. You know, the price is not outrageous. And I've never seen somebody say, well, I'm gonna go here because I can build the same house cheaper here because their permits, fees are cheaper. It's tends to be more people choosing based on the community themselves or the availability of the land to begin with. So making sure that your zoning is reflective of where you want to direct it, and limiting some of those barriers, like having to go through lengthy processes. Those are the things that are better attractants to people looking to build, in my experience. So we do also, we also do deed approvals and exemptions. So everybody would have a deed associated with the property. So in those particular cases, what happens is somebody will come in, especially if there's a transfer of land going on. They'll sometimes need us to stamp their deed to say that no subdivision has occurred on the property. Then they're able to register the deed transfer and everything to go on. It's a pretty straightforward process on that end of things. The more complicated side of it is when we have an exemption process. So what we're actually doing is allowing somebody to skip a subdivision process and saying under certain circumstances, we can create a lot by a deed. So they might, the common one that we would do is in a large acreage of land, somebody has, for each of the lots being created, has 150 meters of road frontage and 5 acres in size. That can be done just by stamping a deed description versus requiring somebody to go have a surveyor actually survey that entire property. So, mostly in an urbanized area though, you tend to get more into the subdivision process. It's more rural areas that you'll see exemptions kicking in. And there's 8 different things that we can exempt on. But that the Community Planning Act specifies if it's not in the list of what we can exempt, then of course we're not allowed to do it. Another one we do is zoning conformity and compliance letters. So these are, they are a legal document signed by professional staff that confirms the zoning that's occurring on a property and what's permitted on it. They often happen when there's a purchase of a property going on. So anybody who's buying a commercial or industrial business tends to want a zoning confirmation to verify that they're going to be allowed to do that activity. When we get into the second layer, which is compliance, that's confirming that there's no outstanding work orders on the property on our files, or that that they had the proper building permit to build it as well. So those are documents that we prepare. We charge $100 and $200 for them, depending on the complexity of them. But it does kind of hold that legal weight that they are allowed to go ahead. So, certainly we can't make a mistake on them because there's money at stake there that's nobody wants to be subjected to lawsuits based on that. The other time we get into zoning confirmations is when we get into certain licensing. So liquor licensing, vehicle inspection agencies all have to have that. And the most recent one, which we talked briefly about, is kennels. So now to breed dogs, you're required to have zoning confirmation saying that kennels are permitted on that property. We do have a planning review and adjustment committee. So it's made up of 9 members. They're throughout the southeastern region. And what their role is to alleviate some of that pressure off council. So when there's a development that comes in that might not fully fit the bylaw, but still has some reasonable potential to vary it instead of having to go through a lengthy rezoning process to change it or a text amendment, they can go to this committee and seek an approval for a variance. Could be a similar compatible use. I think I list off some of them on the next slide. But essentially it breaks down to these members have 2 roles. They have an approval role for certain types of responsibilities related to your guys' bylaws, as well as they have an advisory role to you guys. So anytime we do a land use related bylaw or a bylaw that's adopted under the Community Planning Act, they are required to provide their views on it before you enact it. So If you try to skip them, it deems your bylaw amendment invalid or your bylaw invalid. So, but certainly that's part of that process that we handle for you, where we make sure that they provide it. They also have, there's time limits under the act for how long they have to provide, but you'll always see when we have a rezoning or a bylaw where you will get a written views back from the committee as to what they've decided, whether to recommend the bylaw change or whether they are suggesting that you make some tweaks to it. Generally, before it gets there, though, we already know that it's a good bylaw, and it's very rare that you would get the committee come back saying that no, because they're looking at it from a technical side of things, not a political side of things. So, you know, they can't be influenced by, in a rezoning process with the public opinion that I just don't like that and I don't want that next door to me. They need to look at it objectively from your policies that are in place under your municipal plan, as well as the zoning regulations. And I do want to stress that PRAC members are representing the entire region, not specific. So we do have somebody on the next appointment at the next meeting who does reside in Salisbury. But when he gets appointed and he sits, he will sit as a representative of the entire southeastern region, not as a Salisbury representative. So these bylaw adjustments are the approval side of things that I was referring to that the PRAC committee do. So they do things such as similar compatible uses, variances, temporary uses, and non-conforming uses. So, you know, a variance could be, I can't meet the 25-foot setback, but I can be 23 feet from the setback. That might be a reasonable request to adjust the bylaw. They can go before the committee, the month-long process. There's public notification to surrounding property owners to advise them that it's going on and invite them to come to the committee meeting to provide their opinion. But it saves council from having to go through that 3-month process or that 4-month process, or for you guys to have to sit here and deal with these one-offs on a regular basis. You've got probably more important things to do than to deal with each individual development that goes on in the community. So we are here to assist and provide an independent role and protect the integrity of council and act in the public interest. So I like to look at it as I'm kind of a neutral party in the whole situation. I may present somebody's application before the council, but I'm not advocating for them. I'm also not advocating against them. And I'm not there to be directed by council as to what I should do in it. I take an objective approach to it. I lay out all the facts for you and provide the information that you need to make your decision. And at the end of the day, I do not take any offense to you saying, I don't agree with you and I don't want to approve it, or I do want to approve it. It's your bylaw, it's your decision in the end, but I would hope that you do at least consider, especially if we are recommending against something, consider that we are an independent role. So we're not there to purposely put any barriers in place. We're there to assess it from a technical side of things and from a conformity with your bylaws that are in place. I do operate under a minimum code of conduct. So, you know, my accreditation is subject to me complying with ethics codes and meeting all the criteria that's set out under the National Planning Association. So obviously failure for me to comply with my ethics codes lands me in a lot of hot water. So I don't do it. And I'm not going to do anything to compromise that. So, you know, certainly that's where one of those things, if you're coming to me and you think you're, and I don't mean this in a nasty way, but if you think that you're somehow going to influence my recommendation or decision, it's not. Again, I would echo back to you that your role is to make the decision. Mine's to provide you the information. You don't have to like my position, but my position is based on my professional conduct and my professional experience and training, so. Other than that, moving on to the next slide. We do hope in the near future to move more towards a real-time tracking of permits. This kind of would allow you guys to constantly see what's going on in your particular area, as well as the second layer to that would be the ability for you to go in and check on the status of particular permits. So when you got that person that's coming to you saying, I don't know what the Plan 360 is doing, but I've had a permit in their application in for 3 months and they're not doing anything. You guys will have the ability to go in, check on it and see, well, I can see that the reason why they haven't done anything is because they're still waiting for you to give them this, this, and this. So that's coming in the future.
That'd be wonderful.
I think it'll give you guys something that's very useful for you because you're often that person that people want to go to when they want to air their grievance. So if you have, the more information you have, the better. So. And not having to do 50 phone calls to try to.
Move things over.
Yeah. Or getting 2 different versions of the same thing. So one of our regional mandates that we do have is that we do have, but it isn't fully developed yet, is a regional plan. So we've been talking about this at least since 2012. The legislation still isn't in place yet to fully express our content and what we can include in it, but we have been reassured that it's coming soon. There's also provincial statements of interest as well, related to land use in the province that we would be looking at having in place before really get into a regional, because you can't have conflicts between the two things, but that will be something that would be coming down the pipes in the future as well. Big things I want to point out though is the municipal reform will result in some changes to your land use bylaws. So certainly the ones that are in place today are current and they're still in effect. So nothing with reform removed that. You do have full land use coverage, which is great in your particular municipality, so you don't have to worry about that. But we will be looking in the next 5 years' time to rolling that into one municipal plan and zoning bylaw. Your guys' is just a little bit more complex because, you know, you've got a bigger area. We've got 2 very somewhat different land use sets of regulations and that need to be merged into one, and how best to do that. It's going to take a little extra time. And certainly where both of them are so new, again, you don't want to have all these public processes that have just occurred. People think zoning's happening a certain way, and then now all of a sudden we're coming in with a whole new set again, like back to back. So a couple of years out, I think we'll be looking at merging them into one, unless there becomes a magical moment where it's kind of like it just all clicks together and it becomes obvious how we can merge the 2 without really affecting the zoning too dramatically.
How long would that process typically take? Knowing that the last one took a while.
The last one took a long time, but
It was 10 years between them, or more than 10.
well, and in fairness to that one, there was a lot of things that
Oh, good.
happened during that review. I mean, we had a major land use issue going on in the community that people were a little hesitant to move forward in the process. We also had COVID hit in there, which affected some of our timelines. There was a number of things. But I will say, because we didn't rush the process, it's a very good municipal plan and zoning bylaw. And I think it's well able to bring you into the future easily, and the intent was, and, you know, at the time, I would gladly say it'll last you the 10 years. Provided you didn't do any big changes, but certainly reform hasn't helped that situation, but I still believe in the core of the village that this is still very good land use bylaw in place. And even what's outside the perimeter, that new bylaw is still very reflective of that more rural side of your community, because now that's what you guys are gonna have to struggle with, is more urbanized core and the more rural side of things as well.
Having said that, does it make more sense instead of trying to develop a merged plan for both, to run them, if not separately, but maybe zoned in a certain way, that you'd have residential in the village, but rural residential in the rural areas, that they'd be somewhat separate, but all reflective of the same concepts?
Yeah, to some degree, like I anticipate what you will actually see is this serviceable boundary is still gonna be your primary objective on your land use, right? So this is where you're gonna concentrate your dense development. That's where you're gonna wanna direct the majority of your development. Same with that industrial node up there. I see that's probably gonna be an expansion. Maybe your highway commercial area gets expanded. But outside that core area is still, you're gonna wanna keep that more rural and not open that up. You don't wanna have segregated industrial parks throughout your
Absolutely.
area, right?
Absolutely.
You wanna.
Or subdivision for that matter.
Yeah, and I mean, the primary goal of those rural areas and what WARP was trying to achieve is always protect those rural uses. Agriculture, forestry, those are what should be going on in the rural areas. The first thing, and where some of the biggest conflicts happen with land use, is when you get, people who have a urban mindset move out to the rural areas, and then they expect urban rules. Well, you can't expect urban rules in a rural area. You can't expect a farmer.
You can expect them, you're not gonna get them.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't expect a farmer to have a farm and not have any smells or any, impact on your house. So, you move to the country, you should expect to live in the country and be good with that.
I'd
So,
argue some of that is taxation as well, in terms of agriculture, forestry usage, and have taxing associated with that practice.
Yeah.
And that's the simplest way to deal with all of it.
well, and I mean, the province has introduced the flip program. So,
Well, that's been 40
Yeah.
years ago now.
well, and when people have deferred their taxes and then they come in and decide that they want to put a 100-lot subdivision in,
It's a boat anchor.
they're paying for it.
Absolutely.
So,
But my understanding is flip is even under review at the moment.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, I mean, they've been going a little, anyway, I'm not gonna get into that. The other thing that you'll see us coming forward with in the near future because of reform will be revision to your municipal subdivision bylaw. So kind of going back to that idea that currently your municipal Salisbury subdivision bylaw is only for Salisbury, the former village, and not that surrounding area. So we need to create a new subdivision bylaw that respects that council will make the decision on the roads on these municipally owned streets. Whereas in the areas surrounding it, Department of Transportation will have that approval. It's not gonna be a big change to what you have. It's really just gonna address that outer area. But, we'll be looking at doing a template up and circulating in the next couple months for that. The other big one, which is, on your docket already, I believe, is the building bylaw.
Yes.
And, the big change, take reform out of it altogether. A couple of years ago, they actually took building permits out of the Community Planning Act and put it under its own separate Building Code Administration Act. So as a result, that alone requires a new bylaw to be adopted. It just happened that when reform was coming, we knew that these were gonna change anyway, so there was no big bad rush on for it. And they gave some grace period in there, but certainly now, we wanna take advantage of that, get that bylaw adopted now, especially with currently, you're operating on different building permit fees. So standardizing them throughout the whole Salisbury will be to your benefit, versus having, a class of building permit fees. For the most part, in the outside the village boundaries, they were paying more for permits anyway than what you guys were taking in the village. So certainly something that should be updated and brought up to a better expectation of what they're getting. The other thing I do want to point out though, that you will kind of notice is all of a sudden, under the Building Code Administration Act, they've incorporated several exemptions to the building permit process. So, garages under a certain size are now exempt from getting a building permit, so they don't have to comply with the, National Building Code for construction. Certainly encourage people to build it to code. It does
10 by 12 or is it?
it's a square footage, so I believe it's 500 or 600 square feet, so it's a sizable garage.
Oh, really?
built
Size.
to be exempt from code.
Yeah.
Where it does kind of come into play and it's a little bit nicer is, you know, some of those buildings that will require full stamped lumber no longer have to meet that objective, so. So people are always pre-warned though, when you are exempt from code for the construction of that building, if you go to change the use to something that has to be building code. So let's say your garage now, you want to make it a public garage. Now you have to go through the process to make it comply with building code. So that's why I would always encourage somebody to build it to code. Unless they know for sure that it's only ever gonna be the big
Personal
requirement, right, or personal use. So that is something that's kind of changed. Previously, municipalities were requiring permits for everything. The other thing, though, that it doesn't, despite them exempting some of these things from compliance with code, they still have to get a development permit. So we're still verifying that it's located properly on the property and, you know, if there happened to be a bathroom in it, that it does have proper sewage disposal. So, and that concludes it, unless I anticipated that you guys might have some questions regarding some of the building bylaw, at least I would think.
I'll jump in on that too, just in case there's questions on this or the building bylaw. So if, in the council package, there's a CRF on the bylaw itself, so in consultation with Lori, and then internally as well to see kind of what we thought may make sense and what some options were. We're recommending bringing forward the new template forward that was created by Plan 360 with an updated fee. So it would match the residential building permits in the inside-outside area. So it is an increase for the former village. And then also looking at the commercial, institutional, industrial as well. So the fee for the initial one, the residential would be $25, which is the development permit fee, correct? And then $7 or $5 plus for each $1,000 of construction value, or?
It used to be that way, but there will be a separate $25
Okay.
development permit because it's adopted under different bylaws.
Two different pieces, okay. So then that would be just for the building permit itself, and then for the latter, for the commercial and institutional, industrial, and multi-residential, it will be the $25 plus $750 for $1,000 of construction value. There used to be, if you look in the comparative chart as well, we've included a comparison of the former village and all of the formerly unincorporated areas, as well as all the regional municipalities in Southeast planning area as of November. So obviously some of these municipalities no longer exist technically, but it gives you a ballpark to show that ours were relatively low. Because of our maximum, for example, so our max non-residential is 1,500 in the former village. So if we use that Sackville permit as an example, they got 160 or whatever you mentioned it was 1,000, we would have gotten 1,500 at the current rate. So it is to Lori's point, a revenue generator piece. So that's my piece from our side on the building permits themselves. You'll see there's also a breakdown of permits in the full LSD. So the breakdown that Lori gave us just gave us a more accurate number for us. So it looks like, just based on these numbers really quickly and pen on paper, that it's about 43% of the permits are within the former village, it looks like. So just from a number of permits, I don't know value or anything like that, but so it's not quite half. But I guess with that's kind of our kind of pitch for that. So this evening, Lori's here for questions on the logistics, the fees, the comparatives, the process, that sort of thing. And then the intent would be to bring the updated bylaw that's also in the package with these fees forward at the April council meeting for first and second reading, and then pending approval, public posting, et cetera, for third reading in May, hopefully, and then we would be able to have it in place to standardize the rates for the busy construction season as well. So that's my spiel for that subsection 2.
So I assume that that the numbers for the LSDs in here, for permits in 2021, 2020, are the full
That's,
LSD.
yeah, that's what, so that's the, if you look, so that would be, for those looking at the CRF on page 67. If you look at the 2021 column, that 25 permits is the former village. In 2021, in the full entity, there were 59 in the full entity. So that's that 43% piece. Is 43% of them were in the former village.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think, Lori, correct me if I'm wrong, in the next couple of months-ish, we're gonna have more like demographic data, I think, specific to the new entity. So I'm not sure if that will include some of these pieces too, or like from a permitting per area perspective, or.
One of the things we're doing is changing our system over to recognize the new boundaries. So once that happens, our reporting will certainly become better.
More
And then we'll be able to do some better extraction as well of what you can expect. And then certainly demographic wise, I know there's somebody working on doing some general statistic profile data for the area and a breakdown by municipality as well, my understanding.
Yeah, so that's an average ballpark.
Need a motion?
Do we need a motion?
There's the, yeah, if there's no, if
There's
there's,
for Lori, then we'll.
there's no questions, yeah.
Bring that up. Thank you very much, Lori.
No problem.
Always a pleasure. With that, we'll move on to item number 3 under new business, introduction of building.
That's it. We kind of lump them
So now we
together,
play.
but yeah, the motion itself to your question is just to direct us to bring it forward, basically.
I'll move that council approve the building permit fees and the proposed building bylaw in principle for introduction and ratification at future regular meetings of council.
Moved by Councillor Lenis,
I'll second
seconded by Councillor Delant. Questions? No questions to the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Reminded? Motion carried. 5, closed session.
Nothing this evening.
Closed. Councillor items. No councillor items. Do you have a motion to adjourn?
So move.
Moved by Councillor Thorne, seconded by Extra. All in favor?
Aye.